Hello, my name is Gav Cross, and I'm a storyteller, but I also like to read stories, supernatural stories, which I do and am doing live on Twitch, Monday nights, 9 p.m. And there's a bunch of smashers who sit and listen, and we chat about it afterwards. You'd be welcome to join us. Today's story is taken from the first corgi book of Great Victorian Horror Stories, Reign of Terror. He's a happy-looking chap. I love this imprint as a young person. I also love this because the handwriting. To Matthew from Joe. 17th of the 3rd, 1980. How old were you? Or in minus years or years in 1980. 17th of the 3rd. So we're quite close, as I'm recording this, to the anniversary of this gifting. Corgi books are always exciting, though, for young authors. Part of the Penguin, I think, now at least. Anyway, tonight's story is The North Mail by Emelia B. Edwards. And what I like about this particular version is it has a little introduction to the author as well. So I'd like to read that to you. Emelia Blandford Edwards, 1831 to 1892, first showed her literary talent at the precocious age of 7, when she had a poem published. Later she trained to be a musician, but the sale of a story to Chambers' Journal set her upon a writing career in which she proved remarkably prolific. In one 15-year period, she produced 8 novels, 3 travel books, several volumes of poetry and historical research, and many reviews, essays, and stories contributed to popular magazines. In 1873, she visited Egypt, an experience which profoundly affected the course of her life. Thenceforth, she gave herself over to the study of its ancient civilizations and their surviving monuments. Her work in this field not only led to priceless relics being rescued from destruction, but led to a revival of interest in Egyptology in England and inspired several important expeditions. During a lecture tour of America in 1889, she fell and broke her arm. She never recovered her health and died 3 years later. Emelia Edwards wrote some fine stories of the supernatural, amongst them the classic A Night on the Borders of the Black Forest. The following story, published in 1866, is no less excellent. The North Mail by Emelia B. Edwards. The circumstances I am about to relate to you have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years, I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance, which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and, having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season. I'd been out all day with my gun and had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December. The place a bleak, wide moor in the north of England, and I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering around. I shaded my eyes with my hand and stared anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, not the tiniest cultivated patch or fence or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on and take my chance of finding what shelter I could by the way. So I shouldered my gun again and pushed wearily forward, for I'd been on foot since an hour after daybreak and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold grew more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy, as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlour, and imagined all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We'd been married 4 months, and having spent our autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love, and of course, very happy. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I not have given to keep my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time the snow fell, and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shout seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travellers who had walked on and on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all the long dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail, my resolution give way, when I too must sleep, the sleep of death? Death! I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay all so bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart. But that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered, or did I only fancy that I heard a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and then again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man with a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted the lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he, sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear I should be lost in the snow." Then folks do get cast away hereabouts from time to time. And what's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded?" "The Lord is so minded, then you and I shall be lost together, friend." "We must submit," I replied. "But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I now from Dwalding?" "Good 20 mile, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "Nearest village is Wick, and that's 12 mile t'other side." "Where do you live, then?" "Out yonder," said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. "You're going home, I presume?" "Maybe I am." "Then I'm going with you." The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the hand of the lantern. "'Tain't no use," growled he. "He don't let you in, not he." "We'll see about that," I replied briskly. "Who is he?" "The master." "Who is the master?" "That's naught to you," was the unceremonious reply. Well, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and a supper tonight." "You can try him," muttered my reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled gnome-like away through the falling snow. A larger mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. "Is this the house?" "Aye, it's the house. Down bay." And he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute he had turned the key, and I'd pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked round with curiosity and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served apparently a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all sorts of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. The centre of the floor stood some huge object, gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw, to my surprise, a telescope of very considerable size. mounted on a rude movable platform with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood and bound round with bands of metal, rudely fashioned. The speculum, as far as I could estimate its size by the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you. Yonder's his room," said my guide, with a malicious grin. He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in without waiting for an invitation. A huge white-haired old man rose from a table covered with books and papers and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" said he. "How came you here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law. On foot, cross the moor, meet, drink, and sleep." He bent his bushy brows in a portentous frown. "Mine is not a house of entertainment," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dared you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me over the moor and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "Pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same by which I would have clung to your boat if I were drowning. The right of self-preservation." "Self-preservation?" "There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied briefly, "and it will be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak." He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay if you choose, till morning. Jacob, serve the supper." With this he waved me a seat and returned to his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies in which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in the corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in the arrangements in the hall, this room contained nevertheless much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless, whitewashed walls were in parts scrawled with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios. On the other, a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. And through the half-open door of the cupboard, to the further end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantel-shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen. Yet it seemed stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair. It had all the identity and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines around the mouth, same stern furrows in the brow, and there was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened, and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose, and with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. "I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies of our larder." I'd already fallen upon the viands, and I protested with the enthusiasm of starving sportsmen that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly and sat down to his own supper, which consisted primitively of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, he said.
Sir, I've lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time, I've not seen as many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Would you favour me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so very long?
Pray interrogate me, I replied. I am heartily at your service. He bent his head in acknowledgement, leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the latter progress of which is applied to the practical purposes of life. He was almost wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied, as well as my slight information permitted, but the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence, and only thought aloud. I had never heard anything like it then. I've never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and still leaning forward in the same moody attitude, with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer, from practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity in the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and the mystics of the East were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips as sequences in music. By and by, I forgot now by what link of conjecture or illustration, he passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line of even conjectural philosophy, and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, spectres, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the sceptics and attested by the credulous of all ages.
The world, he said, grows hourly more and more sceptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long and obstinate a war as against the belief in apparitions? And yet, what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various, attested by all races of men in all ages and all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savages of today, by the Christians, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes with effects, however valuable in physical science, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned as a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool.
He spoke with bitterness, and having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands and added with an altered voice and manner, "I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had laboured with honour during all the best years of my life." Sorry about that. I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had laboured with honour during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me, as I have forgotten the world. You have my history. It's a very sad one, I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer. It is a very common one, he replied. I've only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me. He rose as if desirous of ending the conversation and went over to the window. It has ceased snowing, he observed, as he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. Ceased? I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. Oh, if it were only possible. Oh, but no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight. Walk 20 miles tonight, repeated my host. What are you thinking of? Of my wife, I replied impatiently. My young wife, who does not know that I have lost my way, who is this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror. Where is she? At Walding, 20 miles away. At Walding, he echoed thoughtfully. Yes, the distance. It is true, it's 20 miles. But are you so anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours? So anxious that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse. Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate, he said, smiling. The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Walding, passes within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due at a certain crossroads in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor and put you into the old coach road, you could find your way, I suppose, to where it joins the new one. Easily. Gladly. He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, taking a bottle of whisky with a wine glass from the cupboard, in which he kept his chemicals, said, The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking in the moor. A glass of Ushbau before you start. I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid fire, and almost took my breath away. It is strong, he said, but it will help to keep out the cold. And now you have no moments to spare. Good night. I thanked him for the hospitality and would have shaken his hands, but that he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute I traversed the hall. Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out on the wide, white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead. Not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before me in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed with my gun over my shoulder, little inclined for conversation as himself. My thoughts were full of the late host, his voice yet rung in my ears, his eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember, to this day, with surprise, how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images, and fragments of splendid reasoning, in the very words in which he had uttered them, musing thus over what I had heard, and striving to recall a lost link here and there. I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt and said, Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand, and you can't fail of the way. This, and then, is the old coach road? Aye, it is the old coach road. How far do I go before I reach the crossroads? Nigh upon 3 mile. I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative. The road's fair road ahead enough for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for the northern traffic. You'll mind where the parapet's broken away, close again the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident. What accident? The night mail pitched right over into the valley. A good 60 feet it was down there, just at the worst bit of road in the whole county. Horrible. Many lives lost. All 4 were found dead, and 'tother 2 died next morning. How long is it since this happened? Just 9 years. The signpost, you say? Oh, I bear it in mind. Good night. Good night, sir, and thank ye. Jacob pocketed this half-crown I'd given him, made a faint pretence of not touching his hat, and trudged back the way he had come. I watched the light of his lantern till it quite disappeared, then turned to pursue my way alone. This was no longer a matter of the slightest difficulty, for despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my own footsteps to listen to. How silent and how solitary. A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head and accumulated them at compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had but just been listening, and to some extent I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though instead of traversing a quiet country highway, I was scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back upon the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I at first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me. But even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment. I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost? And could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, one outside passenger, and 4 steaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward and waved my hat and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up, the guard, muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters and apparently sound asleep in the rumble, neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travellers inside. So I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked round at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men, and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbour. He lifted his head. Looked at me, but gave no reply. "The winter," I added, "it seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me. And yet he answered not a word. At any other time I should have felt and perhaps expressed some annoyance, but at that moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and turning to my left-hand neighbour, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation apparently of years. My attention began to thus drawn in the condition of the coach. I examined it more narrowly and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in the last state of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a state of actual decay. The sashes splintered at a touch, the leather fittings were crusted over with mould, and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been mouldering away for years to do another day or two of duty on the road. I turned to the third passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in a deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair." He moved his head slowly. And looked me in the face. I'll never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at heart under it. I turn cold at heart even now, when I recall it. His eyes glowed with fiery, unnatural lustre. His face was livid with the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back as if in the agony of death, and showed the gleaming teeth between them. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctiveness. I turned to my opposite neighbour. He too was looking at me with the same startling pallor in his face and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own and saw, how shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men like myself, a pale phosphorescent light, the light of putrefaction played upon their awful faces, upon their hair, dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes, earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were the hands of corpses, long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as the landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud, the ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. There came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain. And then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I woke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued and give you in half a dozen words the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I'd fallen over a precipice close against the junction of the old coach road, and then knew I'd only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In the snowdrift, I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocketbook showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and thanks to youth and fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before.
never told my wife the fearful events which I've just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream, born of the fever in my brain. We discussed the question over and over again until we found that we could discuss it with temper no longer. And then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know 20 years ago, I was the fourth inside passenger in that phantom coach. The North Mail by Emelia B. Edwards, from the first corgi book of Great Victorian Horror Stories, Reign of Terror, read by me, Gav Cross. I hope you found that interesting. Feel free to leave a comment. I always reply, and I'm always very grateful. Your likes and shares and subscriptions, it will always be free. I'm very, very grateful. Remember, you can come along on a Monday and I'll read it to you live. And I'm getting ready. I'm getting ready to do an abridged performance of War of the Worlds with a new soundtrack. I'm abridging it, so it's got nothing to do with any musical version that you may be aware of. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds at Norton Priory. We are almost sold out on that debut performance on March the 8th, 2025, and it's going to be performed in front of Luke Jerram's giant Mars installation at the old Priory. So, but there's an unabridged reading of War of the Worlds on my channel. I love H.G. Wells, and I loved reading that to you. Thank you very much, and good night.